Serious, what's the most disturbing thing in your family's history? My great-grandpa on my mother's side was a raging alcoholic. While drunk one day, he caught my great-grandma cutting their neighbor's hair. He got insanely jealous and shot them both and himself, leaving all 12 of their children without parents. One of my uncles died as a baby, age 1, 1960s. Everyone knows that he was left in the bath when my grandma went to answer the phone, and she came back to find that the water was too hot, and he had burned alive in the bathtub. Turns out my grandma, who already had 2 children and probably wouldn't have made a rookie mistake like that, sent my aunt, age 4, and other uncle, age 3, to take a nap and was across the house on the phone. So she didn't hear them start the water to give my youngest uncle a bath. They were playing bath time and accidentally burned him alive in the bathtub, and neither of them knows the truth, remembers it. My grandma won't tell them because she doesn't want them to blame themselves. Not sure why my mom knows, who then relayed it to me during a deep conversation over family issues. This is just heartbreaking. My dad's brother was best man at my parents' wedding in 1950, left the reception and was never seen or heard from again. He just disappeared. Any semblance of my family's history, photos, records, heirlooms, property, etc., was wiped away by Pol Pot's regime. Anything left, a few family photos, necklaces, were smuggled on each person that valued it. 80% of my family don't actually have memories of their birthdays, as many of them were adolescents surviving years the killing fields. So 80% of my family don't actually know how old they are. Everything I know of my parents, uncles and aunts, and grandparents before the war are anecdotal recollections. And with only one surviving grandparent, it's hard to piece together a complete story. I and my siblings will literally be the only generation with record of existence in my family. That's so awful. It's unbelievable that some people still deny the Cambodian killing fields. My grandfather was the only son of an unwed Mexican immigrant in Chicago. One day when he was only about 7, she didn't come home. He spoke very little English and had no other family. After she'd been gone for a week and a half, he left their small apartment to find food. He passed away in the 90s but never knew what happened to his mother. He didn't even know her real name. My great-great-great-grandmother threw her son, my great-great-grandfather, and his sister down a well. They were rescued by their father, who then put them on a ship from Ireland to Canada. The father, my great-great-great-grandfather, went missing shortly after. My grandfather, when he was younger, would take my aunts, uncles and my mother free-range camping. On the way they would take massive sacks full of acorns. Along the way they would plant an acorn every 5-10 meters. And they would do this maybe once a month, which is about 200-300 acorns a month. Since then, for about 40 years, dendrologists have been scratching their heads about how massive forests of oaks appeared suddenly and completely changing how nature worked in that area. My grandpa's grandpa, or maybe it was his uncle, I don't remember, was a doctor who used to sterilize black women after delivering their babies without telling them so they would stop reproducing. This was a pretty common practice in Pennsylvania. Also, women of inferior intelligence or defect, eugenics. They'd say she had appendicitis after delivering, do surgery, and the women never found out why they couldn't seem to have any more children. It was pretty bad. I heard this one just last week. My great-grandpa had 4 kids pretty young and was dealing with some depression due to how hard his life was. He left my great-grandma out of nowhere when she was only 28, and years later she saw him again with his new wife and 4 new kids, with the same dang names. He pretty much made a new version of his old family once he had the money to support them. Their last name is now infamous to my family, and I've actually met a kid with the last name, and I've always wanted to ask who his great-grandpa is to see if he's somehow related to me. The first person in my family to immigrate to America was granted an insane amount of land in order to help settle and led a town in Virginia. 31 years later, he testified against his 2 eldest sons for skipping church 3 Sundays straight. They were fined 100 acres of tobacco each. 2 weeks later, he threw the first stone in a public stoning that resulted in their deaths. They had been convicted of devil worship after skipping church 5 Sundays in a row. He was then forced to resign from all public offices he held. The following Sunday, while everyone was in church, he and his only remaining son burned down every building in the town except for the church. They skipped town and set fire to every tobacco field that had been forfeited on their way to Texas. They changed the spelling of our last name when they settled in Texas. The only reason we know this happened is because census records show both of them mysteriously appearing in a town in Texas with an almost identical name. They simply changed the spelling to the phonetic version of spelling it. Didn't bother lying about their ages or where they came from at all. The surviving son had only one child that survived birth. That son became a bank robber in his late 60s so that he could pay for his children to go to law school. Somehow our family is known for famous lawyers and not the first 3 generations of criminals in America. Rewriting history is a pretty cool superpower, though. Your ancestor sounds like a dong. Sorry about that. Mom had an affair when I was about 12 with my uncle, my dad's brother, which explains why he always seemed overly attached to myself and my siblings, more than my other 4 uncles, and also why he randomly moved away when I was a kid. I assume that's when everyone found out. My grandma pulled off the "Ole have a baby" at 16, but have her mother claim the baby as hers, so the actual mother is raised as the baby's sister thing. She then left that son brother in Canada to move to the US and get a job. None of us knew about this until grandma died at the age of 86, when her first son found the family. Great-grandfather served as a sort of angel of death in World War II. He was an airborne medic and always told tales of putting injured soldiers out of their misery if they were in too bad of shape by overdosing them on morphine. Think that fricked him up pretty bad. More cool than disturbing, but my great-grandma went on a date with Al Capone, and my great-grandpa ran a speakeasy in Chicago in the 1920s. I don't consider this dark, more an act of compassion. My great-grandfather was a doctor in rural Ohio after he came back from World War I. One thing he did when he met a terminally ill or gravely injured patient in pain, he would leave a whole bottle of morphine and warn them not to take a certain dose or they would simply go to sleep and never wake up. He was a good man. Sometimes the best you can do for people is give them an easy death. My great-grandfather was a really big fan of the leader of Germany at the time, and he would broadcast all his speeches really loudly to annoy the neighbors. Oh, this was in the 1940s in Milwaukee. My family too, from Green Bay, Wis, fans of Father Coughlin. I went to visit them in the 70s, saw Nazi propaganda books on their shelf. I stole one of them and later I had the inscription in front translated from German. It said, "Thanks for all your help with the movement," and was signed by the first field marshal put in charge of Paris. Weird secret liquor distillery in Philadelphia that was stolen by a distant relative from my uncle when my grandfather was on his deathbed. I never believed in it until I got a really big check one day, a scholarship from said company. I have no student loan debt. The first record of my family's lineage is from just over 100 years ago. My great-great-grandparents were brother and sister, with no records before that. You wonder how deep that incest goes. My mum's distant cousin strangled her twin babies when they were few days old. They already had one set of twins and one more child, so 2 more were just too expensive, and she buried them in their garden. But it was too shallow, so local dogs dug them up, ate and played with remains. The worst thing is, all locals knew about that, but no police or CPS were involved because it was common to get rid of unwanted children in that way 30 years ago. My mom's uncle lived modestly in a trailer and had no job, outside of a few manual labor jobs here and there. He would routinely get behind on bills and often had his water and other utilities cut off or threatened to be cut off. On several occasions he would disappear to a large city 3 hours north of his home for a few days. Every time he came back, he had tons of cash. One night over a poker game, some people were talking trash and he mentioned that none of them had any idea what it was like to kill a man. But one of the people there was my mom's cousin, who claimed that he overheard the conversation. Of course they probed him for more info, but he wouldn't say anything else. Everyone in the family knew he had a knack for coming into large sums of cash. but no one ever really knew how he got it, other than maybe poker. He died about 10 years ago. I'm 37 and I just heard this story for the first time over Thanksgiving dinner last week. TLDR. My great uncle may have been a hitman. Could have also been a drug runner. Sometimes business gets messy. My dad's great uncle, or some relative of the sort, performed abortions in his home and buried fetuses in the yard. Same guy was also convicted for throwing a Molotov cocktail into the home of the only black family in the neighborhood. He wore a KKK pin on his shirt the day he pleaded not guilty. Great guy. Weird, my grandma had a very late miscarriage and buried the fetus in the backyard. I guess burying fetuses in the yard was more of a thing back then. Not really a family member, but close enough. The husband of an aunt of mine killed a chap, took off the dude's liver to stir fry it and then served it at a bar he used to go. People ate it. It's been said dude's liver was delicious. Got in jail and still threatened some folks while in there. I don't know what happened after this. It's been some years. My grandfather managed to get his 3 kids and his wife out of Europe just before the Nazis invaded their country. The rest of that side of my family, every one of them, stayed behind and were killed in concentration camps. Decades after this, after my grandparents had died and even their kids were quite old, we found a trove of letters, dozens of them. They were from those family members, clearly responding to my grandfather's repeated pleas to leave as well. Each and every one said they were absolutely certain they would be fine, and it seemed as if they thought my grandfather was an alarmist and a bit of a kook. So many letters, from so many people he was trying to save and just wouldn't let him do it. I never met my grandfather because he died of a mysterious condition soon after they emigrated. Now that I think about it, in light of him writing his original letters and getting those responses, I think he died of a broken heart. That's so sad. Those letters probably served as a constant reminder of how differently things could have turned out for the others. My grandma's first husband was driving her and their new baby, a few months old, home when their car got stuck on the railroad tracks. His seatbelt wouldn't unbuckle and the door wouldn't open. Grandma threw the baby from the car into some bushes and managed to escape before the train slammed into the car. Grandpa was killed in the crash. Another is that Uncle Moose fell asleep while driving and crashed into a bridge, killing everyone in the car. My mom's great aunt murdered her son by putting rat poison in a cherry icy. The messed up thing is that she went to prison, but for the attempted murder of her other son. Apparently the cops forgot to read her Miranda rights and wasn't charged with murder. She then attempted to kill her other son and got caught. They had to pump his stomach. He barely survived. A couple years ago, the surviving son committed suicide, and when they told her, all she said was, "Well, I'll be damned." She was seriously crazy, and because of her we never let mom get us ICs. You know, just in case. Whenever we would visit grandma's house, she also owned the yellow house next door. It was never in very good shape and no one ever used it. One day my dad told me that the only reason my grandpa bought it was because the realtor told him that a black family was looking at getting the house. So my grandpa bought the house. Realtor probably used that trick all the time. Every generation, for as long as we can go back, has had a murder or a suicide, and sometimes a double feature. We don't really talk about it, but my generation hasn't killed anyone yet, so sometimes I amuse myself by imagining which cousin it might be. End the cycle. Kill them all. Not really disturbing, but kinda neat. There was a set of female twins in my family that got married to another set of twins. They all had babies with their spouses. When they hit their 50s they got divorced and switched spouses. Not sure why, but it was a quick mention in the family history. Musical spouses. My aunt dated a guy in high school, and when he took her home to meet his paternal grandmother, who raised him, they found out they were brother and sister. Same mother, different father. My aunt waited over 30 years before she told my mom they had a brother. Thankfully my family is pretty tame. There's a secret sibling in my family too. My mom's parents divorced when my mom was youngish. Turns out, grandpa had gotten a girl in town pregnant, and grandma found out. We've been trying to track him down, but it's pretty hard when we've got little more than a name. My grade 3 grandmother rejected a man trying to court her, so one day he pointed a shotgun at her face and pulled the trigger. For this crime he was sent to prison and she lived with a horribly disfigured face. Over the years they wrote to each other while he was in prison and they fell in love. When he was released they moved to Australia together and it was quite the tabloid spectacle at the time. OMG, the Stockholm Syndrome. Probably my great-great-grandmother who burned to death. My grandma told me that at the time ovens would often have heat vents near the bottom, and somehow or another my GGM's dress caught fire and she went up in flames. This would have been like the 1890s or 1900s, I think. Just trying to cook food for the family and then you go up like a matchstick. Always struck me as a really sad and depressing way to go. My 4x great-grandpa was mauled by a bear and managed to live. He was also the first white settler in what is now Juneau County, Wisconsin. The Revenant was a great movie. Everyone on my dad's side died before the age of 65, including my dad of heart attack. I've got a little time still though. Based on the AVG age of 56 I've got around 30 years. Crap, dude, get out there and make your mark. Time's a wastin'. My stepdad, who adopted me and is technically my legal dad now, ended up marrying my biological dad's sister, so now both dads are also my uncles. My brothers are also my cousins and my aunt is my stepmom. Typical Oklahoma story. Thankfully now I live in California and have no contact with any of them. There is a little knot in the family tree. I saw it when the tree was plotted out. 4G grandpa was 30 years older than his wife, who is my 4G grandma. Apparently his first wife died young, and in his mid-40s, he remarried to his late wife's sister's daughter, who was 16 at the time. I think the word you're looking for is niece. We have two especially weird ones on my grandpa's side. 1. My grandpa's grandmother, known to all 5 people who knew about her as Grandmother Burr, had really intense dementia, so by the late 1950s she thought she had gone back to her childhood during the Civil War, and was kept in an attic in my great-grandparents' house in rural Louisiana. My grandma didn't even know she existed until the 4th or 5th time she visited her in-laws, and Grandmother Burr somehow broke out of the attic and started screaming about the Yankees. 2. Grandmother Burr had a cousin who apparently once shot the former US Secretary of the Treasury in a duel or something. The most disturbing thing my family's more recent history is probably that my great uncle was an abusive priest. You know, the ones you hear about in the news? Yup, he was one of those. My mom is Italian and my great-great-grandfather was Liam Neeson before Liam Neeson. As the story goes, they lived in one of the mountainous regions of Italy and he had a daughter who one of the local men in town became obsessed with. She turned down his proposals for marriage and one day he decided he was going to kidnap her and take her up to the mountains. My great-great-grandfather was P and wanted his daughter back. He put together a group of men and went up into the mountains. They found the man and my great-great-grandfather killed him and found his daughter alive and took her back home. I've been meaning for a while to look more closely into the story because I wonder if there ever was a written record. My grandfather was a badass. He was part of a resistance movement in Denmark during World War II. We never knew most of the details, but based on hints and rumors, we're pretty sure he was tasked with taking out a few collaborators. But that's not the disturbing part. He and my grandmother dated when they were very young, but broke it off when she moved to Sweden. A couple of years later she moved back to Copenhagen with an abusive, alcoholic Swedish husband in tow. While she was away, my grandfather joined the Danish Royal Guard. According to my grandmother, shortly after my grandfather and some of his Royal Guard colleagues were introduced to her Swedish husband, the Swedish husband was found dead in an alley under mysterious circumstances. She'll say no more about it, and never spoke a word about it when my grandfather was present. Long story short, we're all pretty sure Grandpappy straight up murdered that Swedish jackass and then turned around and married his widow. Not so disturbing, but more could have prevented my mum's side of the family's existence. That being my great-great-granddad being late for the Titanic and missing its departure. If he was there 5 minuets earlier could have been another story, or none at all. My great-great-grandmother was supposed to go on the Titanic, but her friend had a bad feeling about it and convinced her not to go. My mom even has a trunk with markings from the Titanic that was supposed to be on it. My great-grandfather had a secret family that he abandoned on the other side of the world. They never knew what happened to him, and we never knew they existed. My mom's side of the family is the Bonanno crime family, one of the 5 original Cosa Nostra, American mafia, in the New York area. Her dad, my pop, was smart and never got involved, but growing up I definitely heard some crazy stories of how they would come to their house to persuade. I know what you're thinking, but he was family, so non-violent persuasion lol, him into finally joining them. A great aunt of mine committed suicide, which is disturbing, but, unfortunately, not all that uncommon. What does it for me is the fact that we're not allowed to talk about it. My mom knows and my aunt knows, but the woman's kids still think she died of a heart attack. We're a Catholic family, so I get it, but in my view that is not something that should be swept under the rug. Also, my mom's cousin, son of the previously mentioned great aunt, apparently had a tendency to go into a blind rage, at least in his younger days. My aunt has told me that he'd go out and pick fights, and then just beat the crap out of the dude until he had to be taken to the hospital. This was at a time and place where it could all be attributed to a drunk bar fight, but my aunt has said that the dead, soulless look in his eyes as he beat up these people always freaked her out. My cousin is 30 and still has no idea that his father killed himself. The rest of us all know, but his mother told him that he just died. Gassed himself in the oven when my cousin was just 2 years old. My mom and my uncles are cousins of Yolanda Saldivar, the woman who murdered Mexican singer Selena Quintanilla Perez. It's something we talk about every so often but never want to bring up. My great-great-grandfather was probably suicidal. That's how he died, and he went out in flames. Literally, he lit his barn on fire and locked his family out so they couldn't save him. They also say he may have been murdered, but no one really knows. Ugh, dying in a fire is my worst fear. Well, my grandpa did 40 total months in country during the Vietnam conflict. He had 2 daughters, so he didn't feel comfortable opening up to them. He never opened up to his wife or therapist. He just didn't feel like anyone would understand. Then I joined the army and he decided I was the one he would talk to. He told me a lot of stories, but I remember one in particular. He said they were on a 3-week patrol up on the border of Cambodia near the 17th parallel. Before heading out he had talked to a platoon that had run a similar route to them. They were warned that the local VC liked to send kids out with gifts for the GIs and would hide a grenade in a Coke can to get a few of them. So my grandpa is out there, they stop to check their map and some local children come out. Then he sees a little girl with a Coke can. He yells at her to stop. His squad yells at her to stop. They're all pointing their weapons at her and telling her to stop. Grandpa fires a burst at the ground in front of her to get her to stop, but she keeps coming. So he decides it's time and dumps the mag. It turned out to be an actual Coke can. That's not the most disturbing thing I've heard out of him, but it's the darkest story I want to share. I was writing a lot of it down at first, but then I decided that those memories need to leave the world with him. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.